What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, I have a very special treat for you. This is one of the craziest queen sacrifices you will ever see. This game is Magnus Carlsen versus the Frenchman Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave from the 2017 Paris GCT Blitz tournament. Alright, in the game, Magnus opens 1e4, and Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he goes straight for his Najdorf variation of the Sicilian with c5, then knight f3, d6, d4, c takes, knight f6, knight to c3, and of course, a6. Of course, Maxime is arguably the biggest Najdorf expert in the world today, and he used to be a top 5 player. He's still very, very strong, and back in 2017, he was rated just under 2,800. All right, here, Magnus, he has a million different options. In this game, he goes for I believe it's the classical variation with the move bishop to e2. The point being, you just want to castle, have a very simple game. All right, now, Maxime, e5, driving back that knight. Now, the strongest line here is knight to b3. That is the way to go if you want to fight for an opening edge. Instead, in the game, knight to f3 played, and this move also has certain ideas. Now, here, of course, White's main idea is to fight for control of that d5 square. Therefore, he would like to have his bishop on c4 and the other one on g5. And now here, Maxime, the strongest line for black, is just to go bishop e7, followed by short castle. And overall, you don't have that much to worry about, as you can see by the eval bar on the left showing already pretty much dead equality. Now, instead of bishop e7 in this game, Maxime, he went h6, gaining immediate control of g5 and stopping bishop g5 ideas. Now, the drawback of this move, it is a little bit slow, and it does give White a whole bunch of different ways to proceed here. And in the game, Magnus finds the strongest line, and it looks very shocking at first glance. It is the move knight to d2. Now, what the heck is this move? If you're a beginner, you're probably wondering, why in the world didn't I display this? Well, it's very simple. Of course, that d5 square is the most important square in the position. It is very, very weak. And here, Magnus, he wants to go knight d2, and then either knight to f1 or knight c4. Let's say knight f1. Then you go back to knight e3, and then you go knight d5. So overall, this maneuver, knight d2, then f1, e3, d5, or c4, e3, d5, is a way to fight for control of that d5 square. And it works very well, as again, h6 is a very slow move here from black. All right, now, in this position, once again, the strongest line is just bishop e7, intending short castles, but instead, Maxime, he goes b5, gaining space on the queen side, and this line is a little bit crazy. I mean, first of all, you are delaying development of the king's side. Second of all, this b5 advance gives White a target, and he may even want to go a4 here, and it turns out that is the strongest move already. Instead, knight to f1, Magnus sticking to his guns, intending again knight e3, then maybe knight d5. All right, Maxime, again, bishop e7 is the strongest line, but again, he delays that and goes bishop b7, putting immediate pressure on that pawn on e4. Of course, now the pawn is hanging. Black has 2 pieces attacking versus just the 1 piece of White, and beyond that, Black is also threatening b4, driving back that knight on c3. Once the knight moves, it no longer controls the e4 pawn. Therefore, Black may be winning a pawn here. All right, in the game, Magnus, bishop f3, defending e4 with the bishop. The point being, after b4, you can go knight d5, and the pawn on e4 is still defended, as that bishop on b7 would not be directly attacking the pawn on e4. All right, now, here, Maxime, he's got many different options in the game. Knight bd7, continuing his plan of developing his queen side before the king side. All right, Magnus, knight e3, the expected move, intending again one of those knights plopping onto that d5 square. Now here, Maxime, to be fair, he has a million different options in this position. Some of the main lines, according to the engine, include knight to b6, rook to c8, knight to c5, and bishop e7. In the game, he does just go knight to b6. Now, the idea behind this move, it is a very common idea in the Najdorf. The knight goes to d7 and then b6 with the idea of fighting for control of that d5 square. Now, if White jumps in with his knight, say knight cd5 or knight ed5, Black has the option of trading twice on d5, knight takes, knight takes, knight takes, e takes, and that would take away that d5 square from White. Yes, White would have a pawn there, but he would not be able to have a piece there on the whole on d5. So that is the idea behind knight b6. And White, or Black, sorry, may even be intending d5 later in the game. All right, now here, Magnus, he also has a million different options. According to the engine, the top lines are short castles, queen d2, queen d3, a4, and even the alpha 0 move h4 apparently makes some sense here according to the engine. Don't ask me why. In the game, Magnus does castle, the simplest option, getting his king to safety, And now Maxime, again, the strongest move is bishop e7, intending short castles, but again, he delays his kingside development, going rook to c8, developing his last queenside piece, and maybe even intending rook takes c3, the exchange sacrifice later in this game. All right, Magnus, he continues, queen d3, bolstering his center with the queen. d3 is a very solid square for the queen overall, but here, Magnus, his queenside is going to have a little bit of trouble developing. The main problem is that bishop on c1. Normally, it does want to go to, say, g5 or e3, but obviously, both of those squares are not possible in this position. All right, Maxime, how does he continue here? Well, according to the engine, the strongest line is actually knight b to d7, kind of a strange move, perhaps intending knight c5, putting pressure on that queen and admitting that overall, the knight isn't doing that much on the b6 square. Now, instead, in the game, Maxime, g6 is the move. Now, this move has two ideas. One, you can go bishop g7 in the spirit of the dragon Sicilian, being kettling the dark squared bishop. Now, overall, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, as on g7, that bishop would be biting on granite. It doesn't do a whole lot on this diagonal, obviously, as that pawn on e5 does block the bishop. And beyond that, on g7, the bishop would not control the very important d6 pawn. That means white could go, say, rook d1, piling up pressure on that pawn on d6. And as we're going to see here, Magnus, he does just go rook d1, again immediately stopping bishop g7, as that would lose the pawn on d6. However, the other idea behind g6 here is it does control f5, stopping knight to f5 ideas from white. So, overall, an interesting move. And here Maxime finally does go bishop e7, keeping the bishop on this diagonal. Now, from here, black may be intending, perhaps, king f8, king g7, artificially castling his king. The rook may be useful on h8, and overall, that would be a decent setup for black. All right, now here, Magnus, you finally gain space on the queen side. a4 is the move, trying to break up those pawns. Of course, now the threat is a takes, knight takes b5, winning that free pawn on b5. That would be a huge success for white. Therefore, Maxime, he is virtually forced to go b4, driving back that knight on the c3 square. Now, here, white, turns out he actually doesn't have to move that knight on c3 yet. Turns out he has the very strange-looking intermediate move, a5, driving back the black knight before moving your own. That line is very, very complicated. You can investigate it on your own if you want to. Instead, in the game, knight to a2 played by Magnus, and now here, a5 was played by Maxime, locking down those pawns on b4 and a5. Now, here, very importantly, in this position, white only has one good move to maintain the advantage, and actually, if he doesn't find this move, he's going to be in a lot of trouble immediately. Now, if you like, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus right here in this position. And your one hit in the game, in this blitz game, Magnus did not find this move. And while you're at it, go and smash the YouTube like button for more videos just like this. And by the way, thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, in this position, the key move for white is going to be queen to b5, hitting the king and also hitting that pawn on a5 at the same time. This is the drawback of that move a5 from black. After you block the check, say knight fd7, you do gobble up that pawn on a5. Now, instead of that, here, Magnus, he makes a very critical mistake. He plays the move c3. Now, this move is very logical. When black goes b4, driving back that knight to a2, c3 is a very common response, trying to break up the pawn structure on the queen side and free up that knight on a2 to get back into the game as soon as possible. However, here, in this position, there is one very specific problem with this move c3. Here, instead of taking on c3, black has the option of just going b3. That was played in the game. And now look at this, that knight on a2, it literally has nowhere to go. b4 is covered, c3 is not available, c1 is also covered by the bishop, and that means white is literally losing a piece on the spot. What the heck is Magnus doing here? Well, here he goes, knight b4. That is the best move here. I mean, you're giving up the knight, but at least you get a pawn in return. Now, a takes b4, and instead of the immediate c takes b4, he actually goes a5. Look at this. The alpha 0 a pawn is now a pass pawn. It is marching down the board. He's threatening a6, a7, maybe even a8 later in the game. Now, of course, black has to move that knight. Or does he? Well, turns out knight bd7 is the strongest continuation, but instead, b takes c3 play, the counter piece sacrifice. Now a takes b6 And then here, the strongest move is just queen takes b6. But instead, Maxime goes for a much more complicated idea, c2, pushing his pawn down the board. That pawn is now a pass pawn on c2. Very, very dangerous. Here, Magnus goes rook d2, defending his rook with all he's got. And now queen takes b6. All right, here, the dust has sort of settled a little bit. In this position, Maxime, he is up 2 pawns. He has the extra pawn on d6 and on c2. However, overall, Magnus has a little bit better piece coordination. He's got the open A file, he's got his queen and rook on the D file, and Black's king still has not castled. Overall, that does mean Magnus is going to have a slight disadvantage, but it's not that bad. Now, Magnus, rook to a3, targeting the weak pawn on b3, and there is no real good way to defend the pawn, so Maxime does finally castle. Short castles is the move, then rook takes b3, and here, the strongest line for Maxime is just queen to a6, offering the queen trade. If white goes for it, queen takes, bishop takes, Black would have a slight edge in the endgame thanks to his 1 extra pawn. Now, instead, queen to a7. Maxime is a very aggressive player. He loves complicated middle games. That is his speciality. So for that reason here, he does keep those queens on the board. Now, here, rook to a3 is the move for Magnus, pressuring that queen. And here, Maxime, he's got a very simple move, queen b6, to maintain the advantage. But instead, he goes queen to d4. And this move is a massive mistake. He's offering the queen trade. Queen takes, e takes, rook takes is one possibility. But here, instead of that, Magnus finds a much stronger move. Just the move queen to b3, sliding over the queen, hitting the bishop and the queen on d4, the double attack. And it turns out there is no good way to defend both the bishop and the queen. For example, you can't go b6, you can't go a7. Those are the only 2 squares that would defend the bishop. And if you defend the bishop, say, I don't know, rook b8, you lose the queen on d4. So here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, what is he going to do? Once again, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the key follow-up for Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave right here in this position. Well, as you saw from the thumbnail of this video, the key move here is the queen sacrifice. Queen takes d2. That is the only thing Maxime can do, and it is by far the strongest move in the position. And I'm curious if when Maxime played queen d4, or I think it was on a7, queen d4, I'm curious if this was the intended follow-up, but either way, here we go. Queen takes, bishop takes, and then, of course, the move is c1. That is the idea. Now, bishop takes, rook takes, and overall, you won both the rook on d2 and the bishop that was sacrificed on c1. Now, let's do inventory. In this position, both sides have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns, also 5 for black. The key difference is white has the extra queen versus the extra rook and bishop of black. So overall, Magnus has the queen versus the rook and bishop. That gives Magnus a slight material advantage. However, Maxime, the Frenchman, he has very good chances as well in this very complicated middle game. All right, knight f1 is the move, the strongest response, trying to reroute that knight to a better square. Now, of course, the king on g1 is under attack. Therefore, knight to f1 is the move, the best way to block the attack. Then we have bishop takes e4, then queen to e3, and then rook to c4, defends that bishop on the e4 square. Now, of course, that pawn on h6 is hanging, and Magnus does gobble it up. Queen takes h6. However, Maxime, he is not out of this game. d5 is the move, gaining space in the center, and now he has that mobile pawn majority in the center. That is going to be his main way to get counterplay. And now, very importantly, yes, Magnus has the queen, but keep in mind, black has 2 rooks and a whole bunch of minor pieces and those pawns. All of these pieces, if they can coordinate, will pose a very serious challenge to that white queen. All right, now, bishop takes e4 is the move. And now, instead of rook takes or d takes, Maxime finds a very strong intermediate move. That is the move, knight to g4, jumping down with that knight and pressuring the queen on h6 immediately. Now, the queen has to move. Queen to h3 is the move, sliding back, pressuring the knight, and now we have rook takes e4, gobbling up that bishop and defending the knight on g4. Again, Maxime, his only chance here is to keep as many pieces on the board as possible, push these central pawns down the board, and keep the attack going. All right, rook to c3 is the move. Then rook to b4, pressuring the pawn on b2. Now rook c2 defends the pawn on b2, and king to g7 gets the king off the back rank, maybe setting up rook h8 ideas later in the game. All right, queen d3. Magnus centralizing his queen, very solid, and now knight to f6, jumping back with the knight and defending that pawn on d5. Now queen g3, pressuring the pawn on e5. Magnus being as annoying as possible in this blitz game with that queen, keeping the pressure on. And now here, it turns out the strongest move for black is rook d4, defending that pawn with a very advanced rook, but instead e4 played in the game. And the drawback of this move, here Maxime loses a lot of flexibility with his central pawns. Alright, now here, it turns out the strongest way to go for white is simply rook to c6, giving up that pawn on b2. Instead here, he does go for the move queen to e5, flying in with the queen. Now, the queen is very active on e5. It pins the knight on f6 to the king on g7, and it is threatening potentially that pawn on d5 later. Now, here we have the move rook to e8, defending that bishop. Of course, the queen was also attacking the bishop on e7. And now, once again, the strongest move for white is going to be rook to c6, pressuring f6. And of course, with that queen on e5, the pawn on b2 would still be defended. Now, instead, knight to e3 played in the game, getting that knight back into the game, a solid move. But now here Maxime, he finds the flaw with this move, and he seizes control of the game with a very strong move, d4, advancing the pawn. Those pawns are monsters now, rolling down the board. All right, knight g4, getting out of the attack. Then d3, hits the rook on c2, rook to c1, flying back with the rook, and then bishop d8, a discovered attack on the queen. Magnus, where is the queen going to go? It goes back to c3, a good square for the queen, pressuring that rook on b4 immediately. Now, rook to b7, flying back with the rook, knight to e3, trying to blockade those pawns on e4. Now we have rook c7, pressuring the queen, and technically the rook behind it on c1. Therefore, a move like queen d2 is forced, one of the only good squares where you do maintain the defense of the rook on the c1 square. Now, here it turns out keeping both those rooks on the board is the right way forward for Maxime. He should go rook d7. Again, the more pieces you keep on the board, the more complicated the game is, and the easier it is to fight back against that white queen. But instead, rook takes c1 and played in the game, trading the rooks, then queen takes, and then bishop b6, pressuring that knight on e3. Now, overall, again, as more and more pieces come off the board, it should theoretically be a little bit easier for Magnus to fight back. Now, here we have the move king to f1, sliding over with the king. An interesting move. The king may play a role in slowing down the advance of these central pawns. Now, we have bishop takes e3, then queen takes e3, and then rook to b8, pressuring the pawn on b2 again. All right, queen d4, defends b2, then rook b5, stay active with that rook, then king to e1, rook to g5, pressuring g2, staying very active, g3, then rook d5, flying back, once again pressuring the queen as that rook is defended by the knight. Now, queen to c3, dropping back, d2 check, hits the king. Of course, you cannot take that pawn on d2 with the queen, as then after queen takes, rook takes, king takes, you lose the queen, black has the extra knight, and black will be winning. So instead, king d1 is the only good move. Then rook d3, flying down with the rook being supported by the pawn. Maxime playing an unbelievable game so far. Now, queen d5, flying up with the queen. Rook d5, hits the queen again and again. Literally everything is defended by black. Black's got a mini fortress here. All right, queen to f4, and now a very provocative move, g5. I mean, making that pawn very, very vulnerable. All right, queen e3, dropping back. And now, very importantly, that rook must stay on d5 to defend everything. Maxime here, he virtually cannot move anything. If you move the knight, you lose the pawn on e4. If you move the rook, you lose the pawn on g4 or on d2. Therefore, what can Maxime do? Well, he goes king g6. That is one of the only moves. He's sort of in Zugzwang. Now, here, h3 is the move. Rook d3, jumping up with the rook. Now, the idea behind king g6, that pawn on g5 is defended. Therefore, rook d3 is a viable move. Now, the queen's got to move. Queen b6 played in the game. Now, king g7. Maxime here essentially going back and forth with his king. There's not a whole lot he can do. He's got a mini fortress. And here, Magnus, he finds, well, he doesn't find a good move. He makes a fatal mistake in this position. He plays the move b4. And this turns out to be a critical mistake. Now, the idea behind it is obvious. He has that passed pawn. He wants to push it. His goal is to push it all the way down to b8, but it turns out this move b4 is a fatal mistake, as you can see by the eval bar collapsing on the left one more time. The eval bar going from, net positive for white to just collapsing in one move. If you like puzzles, try and pause the video and try to find the winning blow for Maxime here. All right, the idea, it's very, very simple. Knight to d5, hitting the queen and threatening knight to c3. And it turns out there's almost nothing stopping knight c3. If black gets that move in, let's say you move the queen, I don't know, beat queen b8 or something, then knight c3 comes, the king has to move to either c2 or e2, and then you just go d1, promoting to a queen. You win on the spot. For example, I don't know, queen to c5, then knight to c3. The king has to move, whether you go to c2 here, king to c2, and then d1, promotes to a queen, and white is going to be, you know, he's not long for this world. I don't know, king to b2, queen to b1, king to a3, and so on. It's not good. White gets checkmate after queen to a2. So overall here, after b4, and then just the move knight to d5, Magnus Carlsen resigns on the spot to Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave. Wow, what a game and what a queen sacrifice by the Frenchman, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this game. I did my best to find a really brilliant game for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. So, yeah, that's all for today. And if you want to see another crazy queen sacrifice out of the opening, check out this video right here where Magnus plays a premeditated queen sacrifice against Fabiano Caruana in the Roy Lopez opening. You don't see queen sacrifice in the Roy Lopez very often. So, if you want to see a crazy game, check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.